Welcome to the Write Good Books podcast, the audio companion to WriteGoodBooks.com, with your host Jason Bougger.
Every good hero needs a villain. Luke Skywalker had Darth Vader. Hulk Hogan had Rowdy Piper. Jason Bougger has Scott Michael Childers.
Bow before me, mortal!
It's the General Grievous. Is that the guy's name?
Yeah.
Oh my. Today we're going to talk about villains and why they are important and how to write them correctly, at least from our point of view.
Well, interestingly.
Yeah, how to not make villains that are boring, I guess.
How not to make 2D cardboard.
There you go, that's a good way to put it.
Cardboard villains?
Yeah. Villains are so important to fiction.
Well, in some genres, yes.
Yeah, to genre fiction. I think we should clarify real quick what a villain is as opposed to what they are not. I don't think a villain is the same thing necessarily as an antagonist.
Yeah, I would agree. They're not always the antagonist of a story.
Sometimes the antagonist could be the weather, a black hole.
Sometimes the antagonist could be the hero.
A fire, a hero, yeah, self versus self.
Yeah.
The villain, in my opinion, is going to be self-aware and not necessarily human, but a character that interacts and has a mind.
Well, I guess one thing we'll start out with is there are going to be some times where the villain is just part of the scenery because the real story is something else. It also depends on, are we talking about a single story, a trilogy,
Sure.
Whatever. But in the cases where there is a villain that needs to be an actual character, they have to have the same level of motivation of, like you said, awareness of the world like all the other characters. They can't just be, ooh, look, he's the big bad.
Big bad guy with the curly mustache. Yeah, that guy.
Yeah. So I think villain does not equal antagonist. What do we need a villain to be then? Oh, master of the dark side, Jason.
A villain, in my opinion, is there to challenge the protagonist and help him overcome an obstacle to achieve his goal.
Well, sometimes that villain is the obstacle.
True, very true.
And they are helping the protagonist by being the thing the protagonist needs to go against.
They're there to add conflict and challenges.
That's basically it. They're a conflict source.
Yeah, a plot device sometimes.
Yeah. So let's take a case again. We're saying that in this scenario, the villain is necessary. It's a character. The villain is now, as we've determined, either an obstacle or maybe an end goal, part of that end goal for the protagonist. How do we make this villain seem like a worthy opponent, like a thing to be feared, like something that when the villain is conquered, defeated, makes us feel like something actually happened, as opposed to a foregone conclusion? What do we do with that?
Okay. You need to make sure that there is a threat. You can't have the villain too easy. You can't have the reader say, well, yeah, of course he defeated him or her.
Or them.
Or them. Or it. If it's a robot.
Yeah.
I think it helps if your villain is as real as possible and not a cliche. You know, it's difficult. You want to make somebody evil, but not like generic evil.
Yeah. Yeah, because, well, here's the thing, who decides what's evil, right? Is someone, we could get to the whole real-life stereotyping, but in our fantasy, sci-fi, or whatever, we just have the hero's point of view that the other side is quote-unquote evil. What does
what makes him evil?
Right.
What makes the villain evil?
Right. So who defines the evil?
Yeah, you're right. We generally get the story from the hero's point of view. So would you say in general, in fantasy, sci-fi, horror, the villain knows he's the villain? Is the villain evil in his point of view? I mean, you can have a villain who chops up cats for fun. He's evil, and he knows he's evil. But is, the evil king who's amassing the army of slave warriors to conquer the world, does he think he's doing this with a pure motive?
Well, here's the thing. I think in both those cases, I don't think the villain thinks that they are evil. I think that in both sides, They have some sort of reason to doing what they are doing. Now, granted, it may not be what matches the rest of
society
in the story. It may not fit the cultural norms of that story, which is what causes other people to label them as evil. But in the villain's mind, the best villains that we've seen, in their minds, they are doing what they think is the right thing. They may think they're overthrowing another evil. Or they may think, I'm doing bad things for a good purpose.
Right.
But they may think they are doing it for all the right reasons. And so we get into that. And this is where some of these stories are actually exploring. Is it end justifies the means, or is it how you get there matters more than the end result? Villains are usually the end justify the means. I'm going to get world peace even if I have to conquer it. Right. The other one says, we may not have world peace, but at least we'll all try to be better people. That's a false dichotomy, I know, but it's the point of view. You have to get into that villain's head.
Do you think it's effective writing to leave that question to the reader? Or is it better if the reader is told from the get-go, that guy's evil, this guy's good?
Well, again, it depends what type of story and where you plan to go with it. There are some cases where, as part of the introduction to the world, you introduce that guy in the castle wearing all black. He's the evil king, and that's how everyone knows it. And then as you go through the story, you find the holes in that story, or you hear the backstory of the king and why he wears all black and why he's in the castle and why he has flying monkeys. There's a story arc for the villain. In this case, it's a discovery of who that person was. In other cases, you don't know who's the villain until they show how different they are. So again, it's just like any other character. You got to have an arc and a kind of a what fits that story best. At least that's how I see it.
Yeah, a story arc for a villain that adds so much depth and makes the villain real. You don't want to risk making the villain too sympathetic.
Right.
I don't think. Maybe at the end, Darth Vader, you get sympathy for Darth Vader at the end of Return of Jedi.
Right, but that was that character's arc.
Yeah.
And there are people who will say the whole Star Wars prequel and second is actually Darth Vader's story, Anakin Skywalker's story of the fall and redemption. It's a classic.
If you acknowledge the prequels.
But even then, this person has fallen.
Yeah.
And now they have been redeemed. It's still Darth Vader's story. Everyone else is just playing in it. Mm-hmm. But then there are others where the story is fabulous and the villain falls even further or is conquered, and there is no redemption. And then there's others. And I don't want to you don't always need to have the villain arc. But sometimes the best heroes are known by their villains. Mm-hmm. And this happens a lot in, comic books for one. Batman is defined a lot by the villains he fights. Would he really be as popular if the Joker wasn't his nemesis? Would Superman be as popular if he didn't have characters like Lex Luthor? Lex Luthor is one of those who truly believes he is doing the right thing and he is smarter than everyone and everyone else cannot see the danger in having this super powerful alien in our midst. If you didn't put in names and someone said, we have a super powerful being and he's taking over the world by making people love him, but one of these days he's going to turn and just conquer us all and I'm the only one who can protect us. Yeah, that's Lex Luthor's line. Has been really for a long time, even with all the reboots and remakes.
Yeah. So that's a well-written villain.
And it helps define the protagonist of those stories. Not necessarily a mirror image, but it is one of those relationships. So here's a question for you. And this has happened with some early writing I've done, and I've since put it aside because it was just not going the way I wanted to. What happens when you're writing and the villain turns out to be more fun to write than the hero? Do you switch the point of view of the story, or do you try to buff up the antagonist?
In a case like that, you probably do switch point of view a lot more often. Maybe keep the villain as the villain, but show his side a lot more than you would have previously. Build more sympathy, maybe turn him at the end.
So you play more with the shades of gray in those type of stories.
Have you ever written anything specifically from the villain's point of view?
I haven't really tried that yet since I was in 6th grade writing my own comic books. And no, those will never see the day of light because they have been destroyed. Yeah. My mom cleaned out my closet once. So
It's always sad.
yeah. So, villain, really, even when we were talking about doing this, it's like, yeah, this will be great. We'll have lots of material. But really, to get a good villain, it's a complicated task because you really have to balance that.
You do. You don't want too much sympathy for the villain. You want a motive for the villain, and you don't want it to be too pure of a motive, or all of a sudden is your villain really a villain?
Unless that's what you want out of your story. If you want to have
that ambiguity.
And for some people, that ambiguity is everything in, especially something that has a whodunit. You want everyone's motives to be ambiguous. Okay.
That's true. What makes a bad villain, then?
Makes a bad villain? Okay. Assuming we have the setup like we've been talking about,
Sure.
the whole.
Sure.
A bad villain is one that goes around saying, I'm evil, and twirls his mustache. Again, how we've described villains, they're not villains in their own brain, right? They are the heroes of their own story. Just like every other character. Every other character that you're writing is a hero of their own story. You're just choosing one or two stories to actually write. But the villain, unless he's doing so in a way to show how aware they are that they are out of society. And it's like, you call me evil, well, I will wear that name, and I will make you fear me, and that becomes part of them as part of that claiming of the other. But generally, if you just come out, it's like, I'm evil. There's no motivation for claiming that evil as being, you've shunned me and called me evil. Well, I will show you how that could be. The anger, if it's just that.
If you have a villain with really no redeeming qualities in the end, I think you have to give a backstory of why they got to that point. Otherwise, if there is no reason for the evil and no depth behind the character, they'll fall flat.
Yeah. Well, again, you have to be careful to give them too much redeeming values. And it could be in the past they were a normal person. Look at Gollum from Lord of the Rings, right? When he's first introduced, he's just this misshapen creature of the darkness. And you don't even know if he's really, really intelligent. He does the riddle game, but is obsessed by this thing. So Gollum is not a villain by the time we get through Lord of the Rings. He becomes I know many people who've watched just the movies and it's like, oh, that poor creature. He becomes a sympathetic. And other people say, no, he's not. So I don't, you have to be careful with that. And you also have to be careful that if you give him too many redeeming qualities, then the hero is no longer a hero. Mm-hmm. The hero becomes the villain because people fall in love with the villain. And take a look at pro wrestling right now. The lead faces of the WWE.
Faces mean good guys for the uneducated.
Right. John Cena, who is Superman without a good villain.
Right. He's booed out of the building
because
fans need a villain.
There's no place for sympathy because he doesn't need it. Mm-hmm. There's no villain that has a chance.
Right.
Even redeemable or not. Then take a look at Roman Reigns, who's also being pushed as the big hero. There is no villain. Well, okay, he's pushed like the hero, but all he says is he's not a good guy or a bad guy. He's a guy, the guy, right? Okay. He has no allegiance to good or bad. So who does he go up against? Who can create sympathy for the hero if he doesn't care, right?
No one.
So there can be no villain in that story. And yeah, that's oversimplifying, and real life is different than that. That's true.
But in fiction,
here's going back to my fan fiction rant. They have two-dimensional villains against an all-powerful hero. There's no reason for us to be, like you said at the very beginning, there's no reason to be overjoyed that they beat the villain because it was expected.
Right.
And there's no reason for us to worry about the hero because they're all-powerful.
I think, I guess I can say a lot of old Star Trek Next Generation fans, everybody liked the Borg because the Borg was so unstoppable, so when they overcome the Borg, it's a big deal.
Yeah. And the Borg thought it was doing good. It was doing good. It must assimilate because that is how we achieve our goals.
Mm-hmm. We bring peace. So I've always thought the Borg was one of the best written villain scenarios. So.
Yeah, at least the initial premise. I think it got weakened as they fiddled with it.
Yeah.
So, all in all, is it good to be bad?
Always. And anytime we can close with maniacal laughs and Borg references, it's a good podcast. So check back next time. Thanks for listening, and check us on the web at www.writegoodbooks.com.